Hiya, kids, and welcome back to Gnostic Ape, a show dedicated to uncovering some of life's tougher truths. I'm your host, Don Jivis. On our last episode, we covered the history of cannabis, as well as some of the costs of fighting the war on drugs. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. On part 2 of today's show, we're going to cover more of the effects caused by the war on drugs. For more in this report, we turn to our own absolutely amazing, sheepishly sexy simian, Gnostic Ape. Gnostic, are you there, sir? Gnostic, come on in, sir. Can you hear us?
Indeed I can, sir, and thank you for that, introduction. If you recall, on our last show, we discussed cannabis and the negative consequences of its prohibition. In part 2 of our coverage, we're going to cover more of the consequences of an endless battle against drugs. Pop quiz. What do cannabis, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine have in common? That's right. They were all legal at one point and even encouraged by doctors. It was once thought that the best cure for an alcoholic was a regular dose of morphine. Initially, cocaine was the active ingredient in Coca-Cola, and methamphetamine fueled kamikaze pilots in World War II. YOLO, dog. The question then became, what changed? Well, for starters, the collective opinion changed the longer we saw the consequences of addictive behavior. At one point, nearly a third of China's population was thought to be addicted to opium. Likewise, by the end of the Civil War, it was estimated that 400,000 soldiers were addicted to morphine. It quickly became apparent that addicts are not particularly productive citizens, essentially dead weight to any societal system. Couple that with a morally conservative majority and you get legislation for prohibition. In short, culture moved from one extreme to another. Before 1950, mandatory minimum sentencing was reserved for crimes such as treason, murder, piracy, rape, slave trafficking, and counterfeiting. In 1951, Congress enacted a mandatory minimum penalty of 2 years of imprisonment for violating the Narcotics Drugs Import and Export Act. The second and third violations carried a mandatory minimum sentencing of 5 to 10 years. And when Congress created additional controlled substance offenses in 1956, it set a mandatory minimum penalty of 10 years imprisonment for selling heroin to a juvenile. By the 1960s, however, the failures of mandatory drug sentencing were apparent, and many were repealed, which allowed for more flexible and case-specific sentencing. By the 1980s, mandatory minimum sentencings were reinstated. Congress's use of the minimum penalties in this period followed a shift in sentencing attitudes away from rehabilitative model towards controlling crime with more appropriately punitive sentences. This shift contributed to the enactment of mandatory minimums that are most commonly applied today, particularly penalties for firearms and drug trafficking crime. The quantities triggering mandatory minimum penalties ranged from 5 years to life. Should it really be any wonder that if a drug trafficker is facing life in prison for a second or third drug charge, that they would choose to shoot at a police officer rather than being arrested? What do they really have to lose at that point? The consequences of this war are wide-ranging. Here are a few of the less publicized. Currently, 2/3 of women serving time in federal prison are behind bars for non-violent crime, and the vast majority of them have children they cannot see. Since the United States has clamped down on prescription opiates, users who would normally get their fix from a doctor are now switching to unregulated drugs like heroin. The consequences are clear to see in the new epidemic of overdoses sweeping the nation. Roughly $20 billion is spent annually fighting this war on drugs. It costs about $33,000 each year to house a prisoner in the United States. Compare that to $4,700 for drug rehabilitation. All in all, frankly, there is nothing about this drug policy that makes any sense, but then again, very little about you Homo sapiens makes sense anymore. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got some moon rocks to farm. This is Gnostic Ape, signing off.
Thank you, Gnostic. That's right, kids. Under the moral pretense of fighting an unwinnable war against a faceless foe, your government needlessly spends billions of dollars and incarcerates hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe you're asking, Don, what else can be done? Well, stupid, I'm glad you asked. If you need an example of an alternative model, Switzerland is a great example of what treating addiction as a health issue looks like. Before heroin became legally available, in the 1980s and 1990s, Switzerland had a heroin epidemic on their hands. Crime was rampant, and HIV was spreading faster than your mom's legs. After the public demanded change, Switzerland moved to a system of providing legalized heroin to addicts. As a result, a few interesting things happened. Not only was heroin now legal by prescription, it was administered by medical doctors instead of crackheads. Addicts no longer needed to steal or sell their bodies to get a fix. Given that the government supplied the drugs, as well as a safe place to use, death by overdose dropped by 90%. Not only did deaths decline, but so did crime and prostitution, and felonies dropped by 60%. Now, imagine something similar done here. And why not? We've already shown that after 45 years of punishing users, that prison is not a deterrent. Simply restated, prison costs us a metric shit ton of money and doesn't change anything. People that use hard drugs are sick and need treatment, not prison. And maybe you're saying to yourself, Don, I don't use hard drugs and neither does anyone I know of, so why should I care? Well, you selfish prick, here are a few reasons why you should care. Stephanie George, for example, has never used hard drugs, but she earned a life sentence in prison without parole for a drug-related crime. Stephanie's judge said that her role was basically a girlfriend and a bag holder. Tell that to her kids. Or how about John Adams? He was shot to death during a SWAT raid while watching TV. His house didn't even match the description on the warrant. How about Reverend John Ayers, who was trying to help out a drug-addicted parishioner? Or how about Clayton Helridge? Clayton was shot to death while coming down the stairs during a surprise drug raid. Less than an ounce of marijuana was found in his residence. Or how about Baby Boo Boo, a 19-month-old that was hit with a flashbang grenade during a drug raid? Now the family filed a federal lawsuit for damages paid for by you-know-who, taxpayers. The truth is, tragedies like this happen every day, and only because we refuse to accept that there's possibly a better way to treat what are essentially defects in human nature. Kids, it's time to do some growing up, and growing up can be hard. It's going to take some hard work, but anything worth having takes work. And wouldn't an end to the war on drugs be worth a phone call or an email to your senator? And that's where we leave your homework assignment, kids. We're going to include a link so you can reach out to your senator or congressman and tell them you want to see a change in America's drug policy. Tell that senator or congressman you say you'd like to see them acting like a human being for once instead of a spineless shit sack. Well, that's it for today's show. Stay tuned, kids. We got more shows coming. If you have any ideas, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Okie dokie.